Today's show is sponsored by Indie Film Hustle's Filmmaker Process. We provide filmmakers with professional services to get their films or series funded, finished, and distributed. For more information, go to filmmakerprocess.com. I would like to welcome to the show Taylor Hackford. How you doing, Taylor?
I'm doing great.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. It is a humbling honor to speak to you, so I'm a huge fan.
I wanted to say that, it's interesting with your last name. I love, you got the fast car, but there was a guy who ran actually two different big companies. He ran Columbia Pictures in Italy, and he ran Warner Brothers in Italy. I mean, he was by far the best European distributor of American films I know of. And his name was Paolo Ferrari. Yes. And, you drive with him in Rome, and he'd be driving around, and he'd be gripping things, and he'd look at you and raise his eyebrows and say, "They don't call me Ferrari for nothing."
Well, if I ever give you a ride, sir, my Prius does not corner well at high speeds.
Well, he was a great guy, anyway.
But
on the side,
on a side,
mentioning his name.
I appreciate that. So first, before we get going, how did you get started in the business?
I'm not one of those filmmakers who grew up, with chronic asthma or, I was in a terrible accident, so I lived through movies when I was growing up. I was pretty active in various things. I played sports. I was involved in politics, student politics, all those kinds of things. And, I went to the movies. I liked the movies. I read a lot of books, but I had not really kind of outlined as a child or as a adolescent or even as a teenager that this was what I wanted to do. As I said, I was a political animal, and I grew up in the 60s. When I say grew up, I reached a majority in the 60s. So when I was in college, it was 1967, 1968. It was major, the things that were happening in the world. I think 1968 is still the most momentous year in modern history with all the things that happened. And in 1968, I was in the Peace Corps. I lived in South America, in Bolivia. And at that point, I had been, I thought I was going to maybe go to law school. I'd been accepted at law school. I started hanging with some film students in my senior year in college. And, I'd go they were serious film nuts, and they'd go and I'd spend time looking at the films that they were seeing and seeing through their eyes the study and the process of looking at style. And I got hooked. And I got myself, before I went to the Peace Corps, I got myself a Super 8 camera. And I took it to Bolivia with me. And I started shooting, just whatever I wanted, making little films that were part and parcel of the experience that I was going through, which was intense. Americans, when they grow up, we're so fortunate. We're so lucky. You live in a culture where most people are healthy. You have media, you have all the conveniences of modern life. When you go to a third world country, you realize how lucky Americans are. And then you have to confront a different life. I was living in a barrio outside of La Paz, with mostly Aymara Indians. And it was intense and very interesting. And the process of seeing that and with the camera, I started shooting. And I was interested, what I'd become interested in when I hung with my film students was the political power of film, the impact, what film could do in terms of communicating ideas and to create change. So without being too pretentious, but at the time in the 60s, if you were political, you were pretty political. And one of the reasons I was in the Peace Corps was that I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I didn't want to fight in Vietnam. I'll freely admit it. But I did want to serve my country. So, that was an alternative. And the alternative I thought was far preferable. And when I was there, it just, you're bombarded with all of this cultural diversity and plus like I'm speaking Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning Spanish and learning to speak. So it was a really positive, very strong experience for me. And what I came to the realization was that I liked shooting film. I liked being able to express myself visually. That it wasn't, when I came back from the Peace Corps, I was there, got involved in we created a volunteer newspaper only for volunteers, but still I was working.
Mm-hmm.
So I was doing journalism. And what I found was that expression, being able to express myself, both in print and on screen. I mean, again, these are little screens, Super 8. Remember what I'm dealing with. It just captured me. So when I came back from the Peace Corps, I had been accepted to law school, and I went. It's kind of like you have that momentum going. This is what you're supposed to do. And I spent 2 weeks there in class and kind of went, this could be perfectly fine to do in life, I'm sure, but it's not what I want to do.
Right.
And it was weird because I didn't have any money. I put any money I had down on tuition. I got up and walked out with, forfeiting all of that. And when I was in college, I had been student body president of USC. And I'm, as I said, involved in student government, student politics, and general politics in general, leaning toward the left, I might say.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been interviewed at a public television station in Los Angeles called KCET when I was a student politician. And the producer there had been nice and so on. I just quit law school, drove up to Los Angeles, went over to KCET, asked to see this guy. It's a cold call,
Mm-hmm.
And basically, he did remember me, and he was going, well, you didn't go to film school, did you? I said, no. I majored in international relations and economics. And he goes, well, I can tell you what, we got a room in the mailroom, and it's a good place to go, and you can work your way out. And I said, I'll take it. And that was it. So, and I was married at the time. My wife had been with me. My then wife was with me in the Peace Corps. I mean, basically, I took a really low-paying job. Mm-hmm. I had to learn how to mimeograph, print, and deliver mail. It was a far cry from expressing myself visually. But on the weekends, I still shot film, and I started going to film. I'd attended a lot of screenings with my friends from the film school when I was a senior. But I really started taking it seriously. I would go, because there were a lot of, at the time in Los Angeles, there were a lot of repertory film houses, that mm-hmm. showed classics. Mm-hmm. And I basically did what my friends that had been film students did. Their film students had seen all those films. And I decided I had to do it. So I would go to probably, and this is no baloney, I would probably see 12, 13, 14 movies a week. Yeah. And I was working full time.
Wow.
So at night I would go, I would go to see a double feature. You see all of Bergman, you see all of Fellini, you see all of Andre Vita, you see all these, at that time I was looking at European films, but at the same time, John Ford, Howard Hawks, John Huston, the great American directors who had style, I was also seeing. And so, I was soaking that up. Plus, I was out shooting my own kind of Super 8 and 8mm movies, and basically working in the mailroom. And then, I got to know the great thing about being in the mailroom, and I think you hear about it in Hollywood. You get to go to every department. You get to meet everybody. You're handing them their mail. That's an important thing. And you shoot the shit. If you're a good bullshitter, you talk to them about what they're thinking, and they either like you or they don't. But there is a process that if they do like you, and they feel that you got something on the ball, they might be, it might be conducive to them giving you a break when the time comes. And so there was a show on KCET with a couple of reporters from the LA Times, and at that time, there was a lot of student ferment going on. Well, I mean, I graduated from college. I'd gone to the Peace Corps. I'd come back, but all that political stuff was roiling. And up in UCSB in Santa Barbara, a bunch of radical students burned down a Bank of America. Crazy, and literally burned it down. And on my own, I got up, and it was on the weekend, and I said, to hell with it. I got in the car, took my Super 8 camera, and I went up to Santa Barbara. And I got up at like 4 a.m. so I could get there. I read that it had been burnt down at midnight. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally went up there, and I'm now at this place, and it's still smoldering.
Mm-hmm.
And these students are standing around, kind of like, look what we did. You know, they have, the police had been there and done things. Some people had been arrested, and there's others, but clearly it was a big kind of mob that burnt this bank down, which I thought was an amazing kind of statement. The fact that it's the Bank of America, and these students had decided to take that as a symbol. And I shot some footage, and I interviewed some people. And I came back down to KCET, and on Monday morning, I went in and said, I went up and did this. And these guys put me on the air. They basically put me on the air, and I showed my footage. And they asked me, as though I were a reporter, what I'd seen, who I'd interviewed, etc. And I expressed myself, because I'd always, as I said, I was a student politician. I could talk. And they liked it, and all of a sudden, they said, can you shoot? Well, then one day, the cinematographer who worked for the studio, got sick or didn't come in or something. They said, can you shoot 16? And I lied and said I could, because, Super 8 is very different. You have a cartridge you put in. And I was shooting 8mm. You did have to thread it through the camera, but I never shot 16. But I went out and I kind of taught myself, and I didn't screw up too bad. And I started shooting. And then I started reporting. And, in a way, KCET was my film school.
That's amazing.
It was great because, when you're in film school, you got a semester to do a project. I had to do things every single day. I had air dates. And I started to become a political reporter on air. I also, at the same time, the great thing about this, it was understaffed, this station. So as long as you didn't care about sleep, you could do a lot of stuff. And I would do reports during the day, and I would do cultural shows because I was a student of rock and roll. I started doing, uninterrupted music on TV. And then at the same time, I started doing longer documentaries. And I ended up by making a film about Charles Bukowski, who was, a great LA poet. And I got very close to him, and he allowed me to make this portrait. And lo and behold, and so I would edit the film at night. I would do my news work during the day, do my cultural shows.
And sleep how long?
Hey, who needs sleep, right?
At that age, you don't need much sleep.
No. It was an opportunity.
Sure.
And the Bukowski film, it took me about 9 months to make, because I shot it and then I edited it, and I entered it in the San Francisco Film Festival, and it won. Good for you. Look at that. For best documentary. And those are the kinds of things that you do. You don't know. You didn't set out. Although I grabbed the opportunity. I thought Bukowski was important. Here's a cultural affairs department at a public television station in Los Angeles. They have no idea who Charles Bukowski was. And I said, well, guess what? Jean Genet and Jean-Paul Sartre call him America's greatest poet. Wow. So, they think he's important. I think he's important. Why don't we deal with it, since this is called quote, cultural affairs, and that's poetry. But, Bukowski was not what they had this idea, a poet. And of course, Bukowski was brawling and drunken, and, all he could do is talk about fighting with women and so on. So when the film when the film was finished, they were kind of shocked, but they put it on. And people complained, and I love this. I take this as a great compliment. It was because there was the word fuck, and there was a lot of things with Bukowski that you can't alter. So I put it on. It was an hour documentary, and somebody complained to the FCC and said that this film had violated FCC. It was amoral and it violated FCC rules. and it was investigated by the FCC. And if in fact they agreed, the station could lose its license, right?
Jesus.
So, we're all waiting around with a great deal of worry. In the meantime, I'd won the San Francisco Film Festival. And then the word came back and it said, we reject this challenge. We find this film a work of art.
Oh my God, that must have been an amazing feeling.
It was a really cool thing to have happen. And then you just go on from there.
So it took, from what I saw in your filmography, that came out around 1973, and then you had another film called Idolmaker. 7 years later, it took you to get to that point. But then you made another little film called Officer and a Gentleman.
Right.
Now, because for people, and I was a young man when that came out, but even I, at my age, heard of Officer and a Gentleman, and even when I got older, it was just something in the zeitgeist. I remember that it was everywhere. Everybody was talking about it. Everyone was spoofing it and talking about it. What was it like being in the middle of that kind of cultural hurricane?
It's a big surprise. My first feature was The Idolmaker. As I told you, I did a lot of rock and roll.
Right.
It was, when you get your first opportunity, you would pay them for the opportunity.
Oh yeah. Trust me, I know.
I mean, I'd done other documentaries and I'd done a lot of music shows and so on. And I finally quit KCET. And because people would say, you make documentaries, you can't work with real actors. And I'm like, wait a minute, when you can get real people to reveal themselves and they're to have all the barriers up, that takes a certain talent. When you're working with actors who want to give themselves, I had to go out and I made a short dramatic film that won an Academy Award for Best Dramatic Short. That was my ticket. Because now I could say to them, hey, these are actors. I won the Academy Award. Yes, it's a half-hour film, but I guess I can work with actors.
Not too shabby.
And so to do The Idolmaker was a great gift, and it was an interesting process because I wrote a couple of drafts of the script. I didn't get credit because directors don't get credit, but regardless, I know I got that film made, and I directed it, and I got very nice reviews. But it came at a time. It was made for a company called United Artists, and then United Artists, when they made my film, and my film was a $3 million film. It was small. They were also making the most expensive movie ever made.
Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate. Yeah.
Yes, Heaven's Gate.
And I always remember for my film, we had a promotional screening at Radio City Music Hall in New York with 5,000 teenagers. It was, a huge space. They flipped for the movie. They loved it. And at the same time afterwards, and the producers are jumping around going, oh, wow, this is going to be great. We got a hit. And I was looking over in the corner, I looked at the United Artists people, and they had these frowns on their faces. I mean, they looked miserable.
Right.
And I went over because I knew the PR person. I said, what's going on? Because, I expected them to be looking at my film and hopefully, like the producers, thinking, wow. And they had this look in their face, and they said, well, we just screened Heaven's Gate in New York last night for the critics.
Oh.
And it was a disaster. And the filmmaker and the actors were on a plane from New York to go to the Toronto Film Festival. And the head of the United Artists, the president of the United Artists, was on the plane with him, telling him that they'd pulled the film. And these people were like, this is Hollywood. They were looking at doomsday. And they invested so much money. And of course, United Artists went out of business and bought by MGM and so on. But my little film was just collateral damage. It never really, I'm proud of the film, but it was out there. But enough people saw it that, I was able to get a second film. That's what it's all about. You get enough for the first film, you got to do well enough and make it show that you know what you're doing to get your second film. And that was Officer and a Gentleman. And that then became a big deal. And I made it for Paramount, and it was when Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg and Barry Dillon were there. And that was a tough place. That was a really tough place. And I liked the writer. I didn't have anything to do with developing it, although I worked with him very intensely. And they said to me, make this movie. Our production guy said it's going to cost cost this much and take this long. We don't like the film. We don't want to do it. This is Eisner talking, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you make the film for much less and a shorter schedule, we'll make it. And of course, you don't.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I get to make the movie. And of course, they were literally walking me out on the plank. And so the first 2 weeks, I was a day behind on both weeks, and they were going to fire me.
Of course.
And it was also the spring after Mount St. Helens, the eruption.
Yeah, I remember that.
Washington State. It rained every single day. Every single day of that shoot, it rained.
It looks like it in the movie.
Yeah, it actually gave the picture a great saturated look, right?
Yeah.
But regardless, it was a tough thing, and they're going to fire me. And Richard Gere, Deborah Winger, and Lou Gossett just basically said, "Sorry, if he goes, we go." And that's you never forget things like that, because in an instance where you got a bunch of executives who really don't know shit, but are mean son of a bitches, and they're difficult. And the word came, you finish this week or you're out. Well, I finished and I went on and I made the film, and then and I had a big fight with the producer. The producer on the film just didn't believe in the film. He was constantly calling Hollywood and undermining the film and talking about you don't know. A lot of people don't know when you make films how tough it can be. You have a vision, you're trying to carry that vision out, and people are subverting that vision.
Mm-hmm.
But the actors weren't, and the crew wasn't, and we made the film. And then I came back, and they had made 6 other films at that time. They were trying to beat a school strike. And I just kept working, and nobody had any. And I finally made my cut, and we had our first screening, and audience loved it. Audience really loved it. And the word in the studio. And it turned out that was the only movie out of the 7 films they made that made any money. But it made so much money that it made everybody a hero. And, nobody remembers, the fact that they were tough. And by the way, was I tough? Yeah. And did I make a film that actually delivered something to them? I was pleased to be able to do it. But what you asked, and this is a long answer to your question.
Mm-hmm.
I was prepared for that kind of response. Meaning, the film made over $100 million. It was
in 82.
In 82, yeah. Yeah. And it was a kind of social phenomenon.
Right.
And people loved the film, and that obviously after that it helps your career considerably.
A little bit.
When you go to Hollywood and something makes a lot of money, people stand up and take notice, and then things get easier. When you're making a film, it never gets easier. It's always a battle. But I can't say that Officer and Gentleman didn't pave the way for my career.
Now, in that end scene, that famous end scene with Richard and Deborah, I hear that almost didn't happen that way. That I think Richard didn't want to do it or something. And by the way, was Richard Gere at that point yet? Is that before or after American Gigolo?
It was after. Richard but my sense with Richard, I love Richard. He delivered for me big time. He's a great guy. He's a terrific actor. But up to that point, Richard had been asked. Richard has this incredible look, right? He has this incredible look, and there's a kind of brittle veneer. You see him in American Gigolo, and he's walking around looking fantastic. In Looking for Mr. Goodbar, he has this fantastic character role where he plays a guy with a knife. He looks and has an attitude that doesn't allow you in. And with An Officer and Gentleman, I had a script, and a very good script by a guy named Douglas Day Stewart. But it's about a guy who had a really weird upbringing and has a lot of armor on. And in order to make this film work, I thought, I got to break through that armor, and I got to get in there and make the audience feel for this guy. And so I told Richard, this is the thing, you're meeting somebody you're going to work with. And I said, listen, I think that you're fantastic, and I know how talented you are, but I think up till now there's been this veneer over you. And I'm going to break through that veneer and get inside. And his response was, have at it, and so in order to really do that, I put him through some really interesting things. He knew he was complicitous. That scene on the bunker out there where he breaks and says, I got nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
That's a big moment. And I had physically just beat him down, with all his mud, his face in mud, and not me sticking in the mud. He had to stick it, that's Luke, who was my surrogate as the drill instructor. But, there were things about that film that I thought were really interesting. You get a really good script. Lou Gossett's role had always been written. Douglas Day Stewart's DI, and he'd been a naval officer, was a little Bantam Rooster Southern cracker. I couldn't find the right act. It was well written. So I visited Pensacola, where the real basic training is, and ethnic. The DIs were black and Latino, and I said, to hell with it. And I got Lou Gossett and put him in a position. Doug, didn't want it. But I thought, Lou Gossett won the Academy Award. It was interesting. It was one of the first times a black man having total control over a bunch of white cadets, in this instance, and he was tough. And I knew that to be the case because I'd been down there. And basically, he was a working man. He was an enlisted man. He was a guy that had been in battle, had been battle tested, and he was training people. And he was basically saying, you know what? At the end of this, I have to salute damned if I'm going to pass somebody through here that doesn't deserve, is going to have that kind of into battle and maybe kill him. I'm not going to, so I wanted to Lou as at all possible. And he was. And it's a great role. It's a great character. And you understand what he's doing. He's really a committed military guy, Marine. Mm-hmm. And, when they pay him at the end for that salute, they earned it. And I think the audience got it. But anyway, going to what you were saying, at the very end, there's a sequence that was scripted, Doug Day Stewart, because there's this, it's a love story. In addition to this bonding experience of men and women wanting to become officers in the Navy, Air Corps, there's a story about, working class girls in the nearby town. This is very real. This happens. I visited Pensacola, and in Mobile, Alabama, there was the paper factories, and they called them Mobile Debs. And, when we shot it in Washington State and had to create that, but we called them Puget Debs up there, the Puget Sound. But, basically these working class girls in the paper factories, a big catch for them was to catch an officer. Mm-hmm. And Deborah Winger and Lisa Blount played these two girls. Grace Zabriskie played the mother of Deborah. They worked in this paper factory. They'd had, I'm working class. My mother was a waitress. I make films about working class people. That's what I do. And I like. And I wanted to make them real. And so anyway, Deborah is a tough character in this. She's a real young working class woman, and the film is about young people, and it's about sex, and it's about all of those things that young people, they're forming themselves. But she and Richard had their ups, like they're finished, right? And Deborah makes a kind of heroic. Deborah's character, Paula, makes a kind of heroic gesture, and kind of gives up her wanton ways, as it were. She is ready to give up Richard and still keep her integrity. And as such, Doug wrote this sequence where at the end he graduates. He has had a rocky road getting there. He pays for that salute and he's going to go ahead and do really well. But he goes to the factory and he walks in and he picks her up and carries her out with him. And it's a kind of fairy tale. Mm-hmm. Although I would submit it's a working class story, and it's a working class, nobody's wearing glass slippers.
Not at all. I mean, it's a factory she's picking her up at.
It is a real, but I didn't know it was going to work. But when you make a commitment, when you make a film, you're involved with comrades, male and female, and you're working your ass off. And the film is a collaborative effort. If it works, it doesn't just work because the director has a vision. Mm-hmm. It works because everybody shares that vision and expands on it and improves it. So, Douglas Day Stewart, who was the writer, I had a good relationship with, and I committed to make his film. That sequence was always in the script. I have a feeling the studio went, oh, to hell with this. And the producer certainly didn't want to make it. But, Doug believed in it. And he begged me. And I said, yeah, you didn't have to beg me. You created the script. I committed to make that script, and I'll shoot it. Well, the studio didn't want to shoot it. The producer definitely didn't want to shoot it. Richard Gere thought it was word to Doug Stewart. So what they did, this is a pretty complicated scene. These girls are there, the paper bag, they're coming in, they're working, the whole factory's going. I mean, basically, they gave me, I think, 3 hours to shoot that sequence. They effectively were saying, we don't need it, we don't want it. And second of all, it's not going to be in the movie, so it's a waste. We're getting out of here. And I didn't, as I told you, I had a real problem with the producers. So, I just said, fuck you. I'm going to shoot it. And I set everybody up. It was like a Chinese fire drill. The factory was working, and I didn't have control of it. I just had to get things ready, and I had Richard back here to walk in through the machines with his white uniform. And I had Deborah and Lisa Blount at their machines. And I got one little brief rehearsal. And what we did is the women who were running the machines, the working class women, the women that actually worked in this paper bag factory their entire lives, stepped back from the machines behind the camera. And they're standing there because they're not going to be there very long. I have to shoot this so fast. And Richard walks up. I got one little rehearsal. He walks up. Deborah's working. And she doesn't know he's there. And he taps her and she turns around. And there's the rehearsal. And then I had to rush them back to shoot it. But when I was doing that, I heard this noise behind me. And I turned around, and these women were clapping and crying.
Wow.
And laughing. They were clapping and laughing and crying at the same time. And these are hard, tough women who are factory workers who had tough lives. And they looked at this scene. And they were that woman. They were Deborah Winger.
Wow.
And at that moment, I knew this scene was going to work. I knew it. I didn't know it up to then. I'd never known it through the whole movie. But I'm shooting it. And now I just boom, 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 boom. I'm shooting it, getting it and I got out in time. And we got the sequence. You realize that that's a sequence that's very, very famous. And it really works. And I had 3 hours to shoot it. It was just a killer. But the interesting thing is, I knew right there, because if those women, should have gone, oh, that's bullshit. That's Hollywood. Oh, give me a fucking break.
Right.
No.
They got it.
That was their lives. They identified and they got it. And that's the way audiences responded in general.
Yeah, and I like I told you, I remember it being spoofed on television shows, and I mean, it was just one of those moments.
On The Simpsons, they did a whole episode.
Yeah, that's right. They did a Simpsons episode like that. It was remarkable, but now I know that's the behind the scenes stories of that. And generally, a lot of times when you see these iconic moments in film, most of the time you hear like, yeah, I had an hour. Oh, that was a throwaway. Oh, that was it. It's never like I had 4 weeks to prep for that shot. It never happens. During the 80s, you had a run of really zeitgeist style films like White Nights. I remember and Against All Odds as well. These are films that, at least in my household, maybe it was just my parents loved these movies, so I knew about them. But I do remember seeing them. But specifically with White Nights, I remember in the 80s, Baryshnikov was, and still is, he is who he is. Yeah. He is the Michael Jordan. He is the GOAT, as they say, the greatest of all time of what he does. How did you approach directing a non-actor of his magnitude in his world? That must have been intimidating as a director, but then not only directing arguably the greatest dancer of his generation, but then trying to pull a performance out of him, which was a fantastic one at that.
Yeah. The thing is interesting is that Misha is truly a great artist. He is a truly great artist and was at the time the world's greatest ballet dancer. I had the world's greatest tap dancer, Gregory Hines.
Right.
But Gregory had done films, he'd done things.
Sure.
But the problem with this film, it was a dance film. I wanted it to be a dance film. It's a weird film because it's a dramatic dance film. It isn't all singing, all dancing. It's a specific story about people behind the Iron Curtain, and
Right.
the Iron doesn't exist anymore, but it did then. And so with Misha, you meet Mikhail Baryshnikov. And you're impressed because he holds himself incredibly well. He is very smart. He is a fabulous artist, dancer, but he's got a lot going on, and you can see that look in his eyes. All movie stars, they've got it. A movie star is a movie star because of the look they have in their eyes. If they can communicate without words and tell you whatever, that's the one key that I think is in all great actors. I don't mean great actors on the stage. Great actors on the stage use their voice. It's all about projection and saying your Shakespearean thing. And on the stage you can't see people's eyes.
Right.
But the camera, the eyes are the opening to the soul, and camera and close up, and that is, people don't understand how important the eyes are. And how important it is for an audience, for an actor to be still, and let that power and that energy come out of their eyes. So, number one, Misha's playing somebody. He's playing himself. I mean, he's playing a defector who ends up by going back home. And the truth of White Nights was that defecting is a crime in communist Russia. It was a crime. And punishable by some pretty bad stuff. So to find himself back inside Russia by accident because of a plane crash is a moment that is very real to Misha. Something that can be terrifying to him. He still has never gone back to Russia. He's never gone. Once he got out, there's everybody. Roman Polanski went back to Poland. People have gone. Baryshnikov will never go back to Russia. At least I don't think he will. He certainly hasn't gone yet. And that's because he loves Russia. He loves it with a passion. But with the Russians, when they can't speak Russian, basically like they're being robbed of their soul. They don't eat Russian food. There's a sadness to Misha that's amazing. However, and he carries himself. He is a star. He carries himself on stage when he's dancing like a star. And I thought that he carried himself in front of the camera as a star. So, he committed, I committed. And Greg Hines, who was one of the great people that ever lived. And Greg Hines is a fantastic artist, but an amazing human being and a very good actor. They made this commitment. The three of us made the commitment together, and all the people around. My wife was in the film. Isabella Rossellini was in the film.
Yeah.
Ruzi Skolomoski was in the film.
So a decent cast.
Yeah. It was a great group. But most importantly, it was and Twyla Tharp was the choreographer. Mm-hmm. And she's, believe me, there's a woman that's got she forget about her reputation. She is tough as nails, and she's really tough to deal with. However, she's great. And so we had a very terrific unit. And we shot in Europe, and we shot in, interesting places. And I'm very proud of the film. When the film came out, people are going, "Oh, well, this is bullshit." And I said, you know what? Every Eastern European, every Russian, Czech, Pole, all those people that have been behind the Iron Curtain to see White Nights, they get it. They immediately understand it, and they understand what was going on. And because, we wanted to imbue on the Eastern Bloc our own ideas. Oh, everything's cool and everything's melting and so forth. Only the people that have lived there and had lived under that system as artists understood how difficult it was. So, I have a lot of respect for Russia and for Russians, but I also know that a lot of the stuff in White Nights, I think, struck a real chord, at least to the people who knew that experience.
Now, you've been able to pull some of the most amazing performances out of actors over the years, over your career. How do you, or what advice do you have for directors on directing actors? Because a lot of times, young directors specifically, they all think about the pretty shots and moving the camera, and they'd never think about talking to the actor, because that's what people are looking at. They're not looking at the camera shots; they're looking at the performances. What advice do you have for pulling out those performances?
Well, that's interesting because I set out. I mean, as I told you, I'm a real student of film. I love film. I've studied. I've seen so many films, and I love. I was president of the Directors Guild. I love directors. I really love directors, but my style. And everybody has a different style, and I'm not taking anything away from great directors who really know what they're doing. But I didn't want to call attention to myself. The Howard Hawks versions of directing, to me, and there are a lot of great directors. I don't want to just single him out. Mm-hmm. The idea that you don't know that the camera is, you got to go through the camera into the drama. And the nuances of the story you're telling is on your actors' faces. I was going because I guess when I started making documentaries, I didn't want arch style in terms of acting style. I wanted a naturalistic acting style. And those subtleties that are expressed, which we experience every day in our lives, are the things that I think an audience can see and go, I'm buying this. I'm buying that this person is in trouble, or this person has inner feelings, or this person is frustrated. And I'm riding along now with them in this story to see what happens to them. So, I didn't really ever want to hang from my feet by the ceiling with the camera in my hand, swing around the room. So the audience is going, wow, look at that camera. I have a lot of camera movement in my films, but I try to cover it so that you're not aware. What you're aware of are the actors and the story. And you asked that question. Basically, I tell the actors what I'm going for, but it's a collaboration. It's a real collaboration. I'm not, you said, what do you say to them? What do you talk? You don't say, oh, I never give a line reading. Ever.
No, of course not. Yeah.
Well, there are people who do, and there are great directors who give line readings. I don't. Because that's, I'm not going to say to them, oh, say it this way. That's their choice. I'm working through my instrument is them. And so I want them to feel the character. I work with each actor individually. I will do a read through of the material. I go out and I find all the locations, or if it's on a set, I still do it there. And I bring the actors to the location. It just once in advance. And we don't, I'll make them read through the scene there. But it's not because Sidney Lumet was very famous for rehearsing. He chalked out things in the ground and they rehearsed. To me, and by the way, great director, and there's not a better film than Dog Day Afternoon.
No.
Chief performance. But the point is, and John, his partner in that was just, they're brilliant performances. So it's just every director does it differently. But to me, I don't want to over rehearse a scene. I want the actors to know their lines, and I sit with them and I work out their backstory. When you meet them on camera, you meet them at the beginning of the story. They've had this whole life. The characters have lived the life up to them. I work that out with the actors. So when they walk in, they know who they are. But when the actors are meeting two actors in the scene for the first time, I want there to be some sort of, if you rehearse it over and over again, right. I know Ferrari and we worked this thing out. And, so we come into it and it's kind of like, well, there's no spontaneity because we know it all. Mm-hmm. But if you don't rehearse them together like that, they know the script, of course, but they don't know what's going to happen. And I believe the camera captures that.
The magic.
It is, and that doesn't mean that there's not a huge amount of technique and there's not a lot of prep. But I work individually with the actors, so when they get together, there's something that because nobody acts alone.
So you don't work with them as a group?
No, I don't. I mean, like I said, I do a read through. They hear the whole cast, And I take, people that are in a scene out to the location because, again, what you got to watch is that, when you spring things on actors and they walk into a strange place they've never seen before, it's kind of like daunting. And sometimes if you say, hey, now I want you to walk over by the window and I want you to stand over here. And then I want you to say these lines. And they go, what? Hold it. Who the fuck are you? And I know we got no time, but this is not doing a television series, right?
Right.
And in that instance, by taking them there and having them kind of feel the room, and sometimes I even say, just improvise, just do something here. I see something they do and I use it and I incorporate it. So they feel like they've contributed to the scene. And by the way, it soon falls apart. So they ask me, they don't say anything. I do that. But the fact is they've been there. And the reason you do that is that the day you show up, there's an army that moves in. The lighting is there. They run in. You do a walkthrough and then they go to makeup. And when they come back, they got to be ready. If they are seeing it for the first time and they kind of go, I'm just completely famished here. I'm completely mixed up. I'm confused. I don't know. That's no way to start the scene. So by having them go to the location, that's something that I always try to do if I can. It doesn't have to be for very long, but it's enough that when they come back again, they're ready and they're not going, well, I'm completely unsettled here. I don't feel right. That's where you lose time when you shoot, because now you got to stay with them until they get comfortable.
Right, and I always find it that it's kind of like my job as a director is always to try to capture the lightning, and if you rehearse like you just said, it gets stale. Whereas you just got to take them just to the edge and then let them play, and that's when those amazing things happen that you just can't plan for.
That's kind of my philosophy. And if the actors know that you trust them, that's the other thing. And then what you do, because I'm passive. I sometimes did a lot of takes. I don't anymore. I really trust the actors. If the actors are good, you get it, and you got to, so that, and also you don't have the same schedules you used to have. So you try to get it as quickly as possible. However, adjustments once you start. If you're deft at being able to jump in during the actor's ear, not so that everybody else. Again, I don't want all the actors in the scene to hear the notes that I'm giving Helen Mirren. Mm-hmm. He's going to respond in a way. Then I can jump over and I can deal with Al Pacino, and I can go over and deal with Dennis Quaid, or I can go over and deal with Jessica Lange. You deal with different people individually, and then they come back in the scene and they may change it. But again, that's a valuable thing. They're changing their delivery. And the response of the other actors in the scene are, whoa, that's not the way they did it last time, which then gives a kind of a live feeling and an energy that I think is good. It's good for the drama.
Yeah, no question. Now, you made a film called Dolores Claiborne, which I absolutely adored when I saw it years ago, and I've watched it many times since. Those flashback scenes, that was the first time in your work that I noticed that technique, because you were saying like you try to hide the camera, but I noticed that technique, and it wasn't a camera move, but it was very cinematic what you did. How did you approach those flashback scenes? Was that in the script like that, in the book like that? How did that work?
Well, I want to give the credit to, again, you don't work alone, and my screenwriter on that film, it's the first time we worked together, is named Tony Gilroy, and he's become a very good director.
He's done okay.
Yeah, he's done okay for himself. But that was our first film. We made 3 films after that. Tony did a brilliant job of adaptation. It was a Stephen King novel. Yeah. And Stephen King is, it's the best-selling author in the United States, I came on that picture, and it was a wonderful script. And it was 2 stories told 20 years apart. Mm-hmm. And they weren't like you did a flashback at the beginning and the end, all the way through the movie. You were cutting back and forth from different time periods. Fine. I loved it. I worked with him on 2 drafts. We're getting ready to go. And then I also picked up the book. I mean, anybody who's going to do an adaptation, I read the book. And Stephen King, it was interesting. Dolores was a fantastic. Stephen King's such a great writer.
Oh, amazing.
He gets characters so fantastically. But this was not This was a Gothic horror story, but it was not a special effects movie. It was not a fantasy. It were
No monsters. Yeah.
no monsters coming out. It was the monster was in these people.
Right.
So I read the book and I went, whoa, now I really have an appreciation for what Tony did, because in the book, it's a very straight procedural. A woman is caught maybe killing her employee and her employer, and she goes into the police station and they are going to arrest her and they don't know. And she says, I didn't kill Vera. I didn't want to kill Vera. I didn't kill Vera. Well, it certainly looked like it. And she said, I didn't, but I did murder my husband 20 years ago. And at that moment, it's kind of like, what? And then you flash back to 20 years before, or 25 years before, when she's a young woman. She's married, and she has a 12-year-old daughter. And that's the story. The characters, the actors who were in my movie was starring Kathy Bates as the mother, playing two different ages, but Jennifer Jason Leigh playing the adult Selena, the daughter. That adult Selena was not in the book, never in the book. So you understand what Tony did. The subject of Dolores Claiborne is the worst crime that I think there ever was, the worst crime, which is an incest. You know, when a parent incests a child, their own child, there ain't no worse crime than that. That's what this film is about. So what Tony did, which was brilliant, is that when a girl is incested and she's 12 years old, it doesn't end for her. No. She grows up, she becomes a woman, she becomes a mother, she becomes a grandmother. She's carrying that inside. She's carrying that. She's been scarred for life. But he was brilliant enough to say, I'm going to bring this character back, Selena, as an adult, as an educated woman who believes that her mother killed her father. And she is blocked out. Why? She's blocked in her mind because of the severity of the crime. She's blocked out. Why? And because her mother's accused of a new murder, 25 years later, she has to come back. But she hates her mother, and they're fighting each other. And the whole mystery of the piece, and this again, Stephen King, is the realization that that Selena has, because the mother realizes she never ever understood what went on, and so it's a great story generated by Stephen King, and then a great screenplay by Tony Gilroy that took what Stephen King was saying and expanded it. So, I get this script, and what I've got to do is tell two separate stories with the same character, 25 years apart. And I found a really wonderful young actress named Ellen Muth, who plays the young Selena. David Strathairn, great actor, who has to play the father, Joe, who is his daughter. And he's such a sweet guy and such a great father, but he understood what he had to play. And the great Christopher Plummer, Christopher Plummer is doing his comeback on that movie. He really, he showed everybody, and afterwards he's just done one great film after another. But you're working with those kinds of great actors. I then had my own idea about how to mix these. And you were saying, sometimes the first flashback, I wanted the audience to know. I needed to make it clear.
Establish the language, right?
Not establish the language, and also give the audience a little zets, a jolt. And so you've got Selena coming to this terrible old house in Blue Rocks, seeing her mother and Kathy, this old woman, and you can feel it. And then I have a motion control shot, which is for the audience. It's where you lock the camera in a particular way that can't move. And I dolly across Kathy's back. You see the place, Selena's sitting at the table, and you bring it across. And as you bring it across, you go from the present to the past. And Selena goes from Jennifer Jason Leigh disappears, and this 12-year-old girl runs into the room, and right there, and the colors change. So what I did, because I wanted, that was the first one that no one could miss. From that moment on, I wanted to fool the audience. I kept wanting to have them, think that they were in one place, and then they say, "Oh shit, I'm in a different." Oh no, they're there.
Yeah.
And I think it works. But what I did was that you do it psychologically. My cinematographer was a wonderful artist named Gabriel Berenstein. He's a Mexican, and he came from Mexico, and he was working in the States. And I'd worked with him on Blood In, Blood Out, which was
great movie.
Another one of my movies. And anyway, Gabby and I worked it out, and what we did is say, listen, just look at the film stock. Let's look at film stock. Kodak, which is the Eastman Kodak, was the stock that everybody used at the time. It's sharp. It's got really strong blacks. It is in itself a kind of cold look. I mean, you can warm it up, but it's sharp. And so it has a coldness to it anyway. And in Maine, where we shot this in Nova Scotia, it was supposed to be Maine. It's cold, it's bitter, it's winter. And so what we decided to do, both Gabby and I had seen a film that Sven Nykvist had shot for Ingmar Bergman called The Passion of Anna. Mm-hmm. And The Passion of Anna is almost black and white. It's color, but it's almost black. It's so bleeded out. You just felt that coast of Sweden. It just made you cold to the bone. That's what we did. We desaturated Kodak and turned up the blues in it. Because blue makes it cold. So the present of Dolores Claiborne is shot on Kodak that's been desaturated. And there's it. Every time we went to a flashback, we switched film stock to Fuji. And if anybody who shot Fuji, Fuji is pastel.
Right.
It's kind of soft, and it has more grain, and it's just a pastel-y look. And I kind of thought it fit for the old Dolores, whose life has been one hardship after another, and she's in such pain. That cold look fit. But to go to 25 years before, when she's a young woman and she has hopes and dreams, she still hopes that things are going to work out. You want the film to have a different look. So pretty soon, when you made these transitions, and I got better and better at finessing them, you could just feel it. You felt you went from cold to warm. You went, there's a near the end, there's a wonderful sequence where Kathy and Jennifer are having a confrontation at the kitchen table. And they really don't, Jennifer doesn't like her and is kind of sick, and she just is really upset. And Kathy demands that she sit down and listen to her, because she's going to tell her the truth. And she has a bottle of whiskey, and she pours a drink for Jennifer. And I go into a close-up, and she pushes it across the table, and it sits there, and the hand comes out. And then a man's hand comes in and picks it up, and you follow it up to his face, and it's David Strathairn.
That's so amazing.
And you've just gone in one shot, and this is no special effects or anything else. This is just the director kind of working out shots. But you've literally gone from an intense relationship between a mother and daughter to the man picking up the drink, and it's the father who incested his daughter, and the mother's confronting him. So in that moment, I kind of did it subtly until at the end the audience is used to it. When the audience does it, there's no rise. They just go, okay, I got it. Now I'm here, now I'm there, I'm back and forth, and I'm in it. And that kind of storytelling is really fun to do.
No, it was again one of the first times I'd ever seen that technique, or at least it was the first time it was brought to my attention. It was absolutely wonderful. Now I have to ask you, The Devil's Advocate. What a wonderful film. What was it like directing a force of nature that is Al Pacino as the devil, no less?
It's brilliant. You have Al Pacino. And I've worked with some great actors.
Yeah.
I worked with De Niro, I worked with Pacino, I worked with, Joe Pesci. Yeah. I worked with some great male actors, and I worked with some great female actors. I think my wife is the greatest actress there is.
I'm not going to argue with you at all.
But, in that instance where you have Al, and again, it was not a foregone conclusion. Again, Tony Gilroy was with me. He wrote the screenplay. He wrote we took a screenplay that existed and completely changed it. My concept of this was I wanted a dramatic satire on the millennium. I wanted to make a statement about, and again, it was in the original source material, but not like we did it. I wanted to do something that really confronted the ego, the whole process of where we were at a certain point in our life, and lawyers who, as we say in there, had become the new priesthood. Everybody deserves a good lawyer as long as you can pay for it. And the ones that can't pay for it are probably going to lose, because the better ones are going to come in and the people with a lot of money hire them. So there's a lot of statement that was going to go on here, and I convinced Tony. I had to convince Tony to do it. He goes, "It's a devil movie. I'm not doing it," and I had to convince him. Then Al Pacino goes, "It's not, it's the devil. Who cares?" I said, "Al, you're just a complete Shakespeare nut. You think those are great roles? Come on. This is the devil. Come on. It's the greatest role you can have." And we called the character John Milton, by the way, who wrote Paradise Lost. Right?
Of course.
So, but we had to write some new scenes for Al, because the fact is that it was Keanu's movie, and although the devil is cool, Al's got a big appetite, and he wanted. But you know what? I went back. Tony rewrote some scenes, and Al did the role. But you have him in the film, and you just have, it's such a pleasure. Every single time he tackles something, you don't know what's going to come out. Yeah, he's got the words. Yes, he knows the words. Yes, he's going to deliver them, but how he's going to deliver them. Oh. And and also his ability is probably the greatest. At the end of that film, there's the final scene where got Keanu, who kind of comes to Milton's apartment, and there's Connie Nielsen. It's just the three of them in a scene, and the devil is basically he's heard from his mother, who's Judy Ivey, who's fantastic in the movie, that she as a young girl had been seduced by John Milton, and he's actually John Milton's son. It's like all this craziness is going to happen. So we shot the whole movie in New York, but we shot that big sequence back here in LA, and we went down to Vernon, City of Industry, with the big warehouse. It was incredibly hot. And Bruno Robeo, who was my production designer on 5 films, great collaborator of mine, built this fantastic interior set, and we shot it there. But I went in the weekend before because I wanted to, again, remember what I told you, I want the actors to feel the space, and I took Connie and Keanu and Al in, and I said, "Listen, forget the text, all right? I want you to feel the space. I want you to use it. Forget the text. I want you to improvise something, whatever you care, whatever you want to do." And I think, Keanu and Connie were like, "Improvise? What?" It was like Pacino went, "Oh, okay." And Pacino starts parading around this huge space. I mean, he owns it. He's just creating. It's probably the most brilliant improvisations I've ever seen. Unbelievable. And he didn't use the text. So at one point, he's all excited and he starts singing, "It happened in Monterey a long time ago. It happened in Monterey, in old Mexico. Stars and steel guitars." He's like singing this Frank Sinatra song. And it's, where the hell did that come from? No one knew. I put it in the scene. I put the devil at a certain point where he's feeling his oats. He starts singing with Frank Sinatra's voice, but of course the devil couldn't he?
Of course.
But that was all Al Pacino. And the rest of it was Tony Gilroy. And he did a brilliant job of the text in that piece. Mm-hmm. But you throw something like that in, and Al Pacino can bring it off.
And not many actors could. I mean, it is something very special. Yeah, I just remember that, like he's an absentee landlord and all those the wonderful lines. But the way he delivered
that's Gilroy.
That's some amazing dialogue, but also that you really like Al. Like you love John Milton. Like you really are. He's seducing the audience. I mean, in his performance.
He's also seducing. He's really seducing Kevin.
Right.
He's seducing Keanu. I love it. When there's a sequence, and let me tell you, tough sequence. There's a sequence where he's walking through Chinatown with Kevin.
Yeah.
And they're going through Chinatown, and he goes to this Chinese vendor and he says, "Where's the chicken that can predict the future?" And he tells Kevin about this, and Kevin is just like, "Who is this guy?" He's the and I had Al all the way through. It was my idea to basically have him speak all these different languages. Every time you see Al, he's speaking in a different language. He's speaking in Chinese, he's speaking in Spanish in the subway, he's speaking this and that and so forth. But anyway, he's in Chinatown, and he speaks to the vendor in Chinese. And
I remember that scene.
And it was, let me tell you, we stole that sequence. We had to go in and shoot it without any control, because you can't control Chinatown. It was wild. I mean, talk about, there was a guy named Bert Harris who was my AD. He was very famous. He used to shoot a lot with Lumet in New York. And he said, there's no way to do it. Just go steal it. But anyway, at the end of that sequence, he's taken Kevin in. It's part of a seduction where he's king of the world. He's head of this huge international corporate law firm, all those things. And at the end, he goes across the street and he's like, "Where's your limousine?" He says, "Kevin, it's New York. Take the subway, take the train, learn it." And he's got the token, and he's going down into the subway. And so you're going, this guy who the master of the universe still takes the subway in New York. You got to love him. You got to love him.
It's amazing. Now, one of the films in your career that really I know meant a lot to you, and obviously meant a lot to a lot of people, was Ray, and you bringing Ray Charles' story to the big screen. I know that took you a while to get going. How did you?
15 years.
Yeah, I know that was like a real big passion project for years, and then finally, Jamie showed up, and he was Ray. I mean, there's no doubt about it. How was it bringing that to life? How did that performance? Because obviously he won the Oscar with that performance, and it is uncanny. I mean, you watch, it is uncanny. Not only his performance, but he could, like, his voice can sing like Ray, sounds like Ray. How did that work?
Well, two things. It took me 15 years to get that film made. It's kind of fortuitous, because I wouldn't have had Jamie Foxx if I'd done it, at the very beginning. And partnering with an actor. I talked a lot here about partnering with actors. I think that a great partnership was Jamie and myself. I cast him. I didn't know him, and he was an irreverent comedian. He's done booty calls. But I found out when I talked to him that he'd gone to university on a piano scholarship. And I said, funk and jazz? No, classical. When you hear that Jamie Foxx, the irreverent comedian, played classical music and went to university on the basis of the fact that he played it brilliantly, you now realize whose this guy is. And you realize he's got depth, he's got incredible soul, and he's really smart. And I just cast him on the spot. I just cast him. And that dedication, that sense that Jamie and I were together, went all the way through the film. Because my sense was for him, Jamie lives in the black community. He's very much a black man in a black community. And I said, listen, we're dealing with fire here. Ray Charles is the greatest. Ray Charles is it, and everybody knows it. And if we fuck up, you're going to spend the rest of your life apologizing and going around to your uncle and cousin and saying, "Jimmy, you just couldn't do it," And I'm going to look at every black friend I have, and I'm going to say, "How dare you?" And so it was kind of bonding there. But the other part of it is, if you didn't notice, I'm not black.
I didn't notice that.
But what you do in that instance, because I'm making most of the cast is black, and I'm telling a story about a black man. Now, Ray Charles never had a problem. Ray Charles, and again, I knew him for 15 years, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. But he trusted me, and he wanted me to make the film, and he never took the rights away. How many times I had to go back and apologize and nobody would make it? He never took the rights away.
And you kept asking for the rights, but just a couple more years. Just a couple more years.
Yeah, exactly. But in reality, I listened. I've got the screenwriter was, I wrote the story, and then the screenwriter came in. He was black, and he had he was from the South, and he had that voice, and he knew. So you've got to listen because of what you didn't experience and what you don't know. And with Jamie and all the other actors, and I mean, Regina King is going through a huge thing right now.
Yes,
but I cast her as Margie Hendricks. She's as good in Ray as she's been in anything else. I mean, she is so great. She embodied that woman, and she and Jamie just created. And Kerry Washington has become a huge star. They're in this movie, and they're both playing incredible roles. One of the great pains I had with Ray, and Anjanou Ellis, who played Marianne, and Sharon Warren, who played Ray's mother, who was brilliant, and she was not a professional actress when I met her. But I had 4 women that I think all deserved to be nominated for Best Supporting Actress. They weren't the center of the movie, but they were big roles, and they all kicked ass. When you're a director and these actors have given you so much, and they were on board. It was an incredible collaboration. I loved them all. What I should have said is say, Carrie, you're brilliant, as D, B, Ray's wife, but I'm going to go with Regina. Or Regina, you're fantastic, but I'm going to go with Sharon Warren. Or Anjanou, you're terrific, but I'm going with Kerry Washington. I didn't. And you know what? Not one of them got nominated, and they should have been. They really should have been. All of them should have been nominated, although that's kind of much for one film. But what happened is they split the vote. And that sometimes you got to be pragmatic. But I still couldn't say to him, you're out and this person's in.
Right. They were all just too good.
They were, let me tell you, and of course I'm prejudiced because I directed the movie. But, the thing of collaborating with people who know what they're talking about, who were raised black, they're raised in a community that, and Jimmy White, who had written the dialogue, knew what he was doing. They knew that fit. I mean, it was country, as he's country, and so was Ray Charles country, But the fact is, we all collaborated beautifully together, and they gave me everything I asked them for. It was a fantastic experience, and Jamie and I are still very, very close.
And I have to ask you, there was a movie that you did not direct, but you were the editor and producer on, which is arguably still one of my favorite documentaries of all time, When We Were Kings. Now, I know that movie has a story because it took them, you shot, you didn't shoot it, but the director shot it. And then 20 years later or something like that, you made the movie or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, basically they were shooting a concert film in Africa. That's a sore point for me because I was stupid, pardon me. They came to me with a film it didn't work, that they couldn't ever do anything with, and asked me to come in. And I was president of the Directors Guild. So I didn't want to take the director's credit. But the fact is, I made that film. I did. I mean, I came in, I did all the interviews with Mailer, Plimpton, Malik, his biographer, Spike Lee. I called Spike up because he'd gone to Africa and never interviewed one African. He'd never talked, here's this story, but it's about Ali going to Africa and capturing that spirit. So I did all the interviews. I had final cut of the film. I went back and bought they weren't there for the fight. That whole last act I confected and made that like they were there because I bought the footage from the fight. But in any event, I'm very proud of it. And the reason I made the film is that Ali, to me, was the greatest movie star of my generation. What a great person. What an incredible, incredible presence. And I wanted my sons, because at the end of his life, when he got Parkinson's and he was all shaking, the producer and Leon went, let's go shoot him now. It'll be a good tear at the end. I said, no fucking way. I don't want the world to see that. I want the world to see this man who was the champ, who was in charge, in complete control of everything. And I want them to go out realizing what I realized, which there was nobody alive like Muhammad Ali. And that's, I was celebrating him actually so my two sons could see that.
Yeah, and I just remember watching it, and you set that story up so beautifully as Foreman as this absolute monolith, and honestly, physically, Ali was not the same as Foreman. Foreman was a monster, but Ali.
But you have to understand that with the way the film came to me, there was a, what happened in the fight.
Of course.
And in the first press conference, Ali kind of predicts it all, and there was no film. It was just like, what are we going to look at this all for? So what I had to do was build up, as you were just saying, George Foreman's invincibility, and when you get that old footage where you see him literally knock Joe Frazier off his feet, you see him take Ken Norton and destroy him. Everybody in his path he was destroying. And now, I get Mailer and Plimpton to talk about the fact that Ali, in that press conference where he's talking about this or that, he's terrified. He's terrified. He thinks he's going to lose, but he has no option. He has to come back from, the draft dodging thing and so forth. And, so I kind of structured that whole movie to be able to get to the conclusion that it was so obvious. But the other reason I wanted to do the film is that I made the film for women. I happen to love boxing, and I love the sweet sport, the sweet science. But most women go, oh, it's terrible. It's just such a terrible thing. And it's brutal. And yes, it is brutal, but it's brutal and they're stupid. And so I said, the people who really understand boxing understand that it's heart. It's skill, it's brains, and it's heart. And the great fighters have it. They're not just lugs. They have it. Mm-hmm. And Muhammad Ali was so smart. Muhammad Ali couldn't beat George Foreman. Come on. He's in his 30s. George Foreman's 24. He's invincible. Ali won that fight here. Mm-hmm. He won that fight by absolutely out-maneuvering mentally George Foreman. And all of that stuff that went on. And so you kind of see it. Plus I had, Norman Mailer, who incredible voice. George Plimpton, incredible voice. Spike Lee, who, can talk about, in rightfully and also, he can talk about black people in America. He's focused his career on. But he also understood that nobody has any history. People had forgotten who Muhammad Ali was. So you could have him put that in context. And then I had a friend who had been part of Peter Brook's International Theater Company named Malik Babayoyo. He was from Mali. And he actually was the voice of Africa in that film. And he could talk about, as an African, what they thought of Ali, how they looked, because Foreman's darker. Foreman's much darker. He should be the guy they're. Instead, they say, no, it has nothing to do with the color of his skin. Ali embodied what Africa was about. We loved him. And anyway, in that film, you see that evolution. And you also realize how great a champion he was, because when women see the film, I succeeded. They come out and they go, oh, he won that by being smarter. He psychologically psyched him out.
Oh, completely.
And they get it. And then and that's what I was setting out to do.
What drives you to continue to make movies? I mean, you've made some of the greatest movies in Hollywood history, arguably speaking. What keeps you wanting to keep making stories, making movies? I told you when I was in the Peace Corps and I started with my Super 8 camera, and it excites you. Getting the opportunity to tell. I'm a storyteller. As I said, I'm more interested in you seeing the nuances on an actor's face and telling the process on camera than I am in creating some big camera move that everybody goes, wow. Because when we're honest with what you say, those big camera moves take you out of the movie. What they're saying is, oh, wow, this filmmaker really is showing me something. And so I'm back here looking at it,
instead of in there with the actors doing the story.
Right.
And that isn't, and again, that's not said to put anybody down. I love directors with great technique. I'm a fan of it. I just don't choose to tell my stories that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the excitement of having a story, like I said, I just developed 6 projects. I want to make all of them. And the last few years, it's tough. I mean, I would never be able to make Ray today. They want a black director to do it. It's just not, I can't do it. So I was lucky to be able to have that experience. You know, I knew Ray Charles, and I felt I did him justice, and he told me I did. But you know, today's world is different. But I still have a passion to tell, stories that excite me, and you know, the fact that I can, until I, hopefully, it's hard getting money, harder now than it ever was. If I get the opportunity, you can bet I'm going to jump out there and be the first one out of the blocks at the starting gate, and be able to be there when I come around at the finish line, because it's a great gift. It's a great opportunity, and if you have the hunger to tell the story and you work with collaborators, that the other thing is the realization that you're not a novelist alone at your typewriter or a painter or easel. You need really talented people. You've got to seduce a whole group of people, whether they're actors or crew members, to come along with you. And then you've got to listen to them, because they're all contributing. So that when you finish it, you've been through war together, but you also realize, God, we put something together. We put something together. All of us, collaboration, and that it's better than anybody could have done alone. And that process, if that's what you like doing, and again, I like all the processes of filmmaking. I love in the editing room. I love, pre-production, getting things set. But it's when you're shooting. That's when you're dancing. That's when you're, because you got to come up. There's always going to be things that come out of nowhere. There's all these things that are you never expected and can destroy you. And how about things on your feet and solve them and shoot your way out of a corner is what's exhilarating. It really is.
Now, I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all of my guests. What advice would you give a filmmaker trying to break into the business today?
Grab a camera and tell a story. I mean, it's easier today than it ever was. But, I got my break to be able to make dramatic film because I shot a dramatic short. And it won an Academy Award, and that was the ticket for me. But without it, people would have still said, yeah, you did documentaries, but can you work with actors? Can you tell a story? Prove it. And you don't need to do half hour. You can do 15 minutes. It's hard to tell a short story and make it make sense, but you can do it. And now that you've got an iPhone, you can shoot whatever you want. I didn't have that option. I had to make things look, cool and get a cinematographer. I mean, sooner or later, you want to have people. And I would suggest also the idea of, even though you're using an iPhone, get somebody to shoot it. Because you need to talk to the actors. You want a great editor. People can do, Steven Soderbergh is a friend of mine, and he's a great director. But, he shoots, he edits, he does it all himself.
Everything.
And, that's great. I could never do that. And I feed off of the energy of all those collaborators, because they got great ideas. You just have to know, you can't take their word for everything. Yes, they're talented, but it's you making the film. So you say, I want to know what you think. I want to get these ideas. And then you finally have to say, those are all interesting things, but I'm doing it this way, my way. Because you can't sit in the movie theater at the end as people are walking out telling them, oh, that wasn't my idea. No, it's got your name on it. There it is. So, what I would say is choose a group of people, keep a team small, find some you think can act, and make a small short film that you can show as your calling card.
Now, what is the lesson that took you the longest to learn, whether in the film industry or in life?
It's interesting. I'm going to tell you a story
Okay.
of this brilliant, brilliant man that I knew named Ray Charles. And I was using him to record some early Lowell Fulsom albums. He played piano for Lowell Fulsom on the road. Lowell Fulsom was a great blues man. Every day I have the blues. So, and Ray was going to, I asked him, what about an arranger that puts this together? He says, hell, I arrange those things. I'll do it for you. So I was in Ray's studio, and Ray had always been really cool with me, really cool. Taylor, you got the eyes, you got the passion, I'm supporting you. But he was sitting in the chair that he knew a lot about, which is music. And he was going to be putting together the band. I had a wonderful young blues guy from Louisiana named Chris Thomas King. And he's really good. But he was going to sing and play the guitar, but the band is. But before we did that, I had a sequence in the film where I wanted Ray to be playing a kind of contemplative blues. And, he's hurting. He has never been on the road before. He's a blind man. He's out with a bunch of musicians. They finished the gig. Guys are at the bar, and they got some girls, and they're going to go out. And Ray wants to go with him. And he's sitting there alone with the piano. He says, "Hey, fellas, where are you going?" And they hear this guy say, "We don't need no cripple with us. Let's get out of here." And he's left. And this is all leading up to his pain and his sadness, and when he starts taking heroin. So it was these things. You need these scenes to build up to show how completely bereft he is of any kind of joy in his life. So after those people leave, he starts playing this little melody, little kind of contemplative blues on the piano, and it becomes the intro to the next night when they're performing Every Day I Have the Blues, Lowell Fulsom's thing. So I had a very specific, it's my creation of this scene where I wanted a piano intro that then becomes the next night, and then afterwards he goes and shoots heroin because he's so, lonely. So I asked Ray, I describe how I want it. He's there. We were alone in the studio. There's the engineer and myself and Ray. And I describe what I want, and he sits down and starts playing it. And it's real showy. It's just not at all what I want. And he finishes and says, "How's that?" And I said, well, to tell you the truth, Ray, it wasn't what I wanted. It's way too showy. It's way too busy. And it just doesn't work. And Ray Charles, who'd been so nice to me, so cool, now turns and says, "Listen, motherfucker, I'm doing this as a favor to you. I played that son of a bitch exactly like you described it. Now you better get your shit together or I'm walking out of here right now." And the man who had been so cool to me was testing me, right? And what he said was right. I thought about it. And now I said, because you can hear, I know how to talk. And, directors can talk and talk and talk. Well, the lesson that I learned, I stopped. My heart was beating. I looked behind the glass at the booth. The engineer kind of slid down in his chair below. You couldn't see.
You're all alone. You're all alone.
When the rattlesnake came out of Ray Charles, let me tell you, he was frightening. And so I thought I had to think really quickly. And now I came back and I described what I wanted in 25% of the words that I'd originally used. And Ray said, "Okay, great." Turned around, played it perfectly, played exactly what I wanted. And he finished and he said, "How's that?" And I said, "It was perfect, Ray. It was just right." He said, "Okay, just say what you mean."
So when you say 25% less, do you mean that you would just
No, 75% less.
75%. Right.
25% of the words I'd originally used. In other words, the lesson learned for filmmakers, don't talk so much. You're on the set, you're there, you're communicating.
Sure.
And Ray, sometimes people use their hands, they're trying to explain. All this goes into what you're saying. Ray couldn't see any of that. He heard what I said, and he played it the way I described it. And I know Ray Charles. He played it the way I described it. I fucked up. I used too many words and too many mixed up things. And now he forced me to take 75% of the bullshit out. And I thought he gave 25% of the words, and he knew exactly what it was, and he delivered what I asked. And so I think the best advice is what Ray Charles said. Just say what you mean, and don't dress it up with all that bullshit.
And last question, 3 of your favorite films of all time.
Oh, God. That's really hard because I told you how much I love films.
Sure.
I love films. Treasure of Sierra Madre is it's a perfect film. I think that The Wild Bunch, pretty amazing film.
Yeah.
A really amazing film about age and about America. And then the rest are, I'll just give you, I can't give you, by giving you a third, then I'm going to leave those 2, and then realize that, Kurosawa should be in there.
Sure.
Fellini should be in there. Andre Vajda, who is one of my favorite directors, is a Czech director. There are too many. Yanni Mu is a great director. Mm-hmm. You've seen films that stop your breath, and you realize that there are filmmakers out there who can truly tell a story and make you feel something that nothing else it's film that will change your perspective on life. So I'm not going to give you a third.
Fair enough.
It would be one of those filmmakers.
Taylor, thank you so much for your time and your stories and your advice. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. So thank you so much, and keep doing what you do. We need more films from you, sir.
Great. I really appreciate it.